today's World Insight, Putin arrives in Turkey after its visit to Syria. How will Turkey pivot in this volatile region? And China's foreign exchange reserves rose in December. How can China maintain economic growth? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin today's show in Istanbul, where Russian President Vladimir Putin meets his Turkey counterpart Erdogan to inaugurate a new gas pipeline, with the conflict in Libya and Syria also on the agenda. Putin's visit to Turkey also follows his surprise visit to Syria, as tensions run high in the Middle East after the death of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, assassinated by the United States. Take a look at this.
Middle East tensions spike. Amid the escalating situation, Russian President Putin met his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Bilateral relations have improved thanks to energy cooperation, but there are differences over Syria and Libya. A day earlier, Putin just wrapped up a surprise visit to Syria, where he held talks with the country's leader, Bashar al-Assad. This unannounced trip to Syria marked Putin's first visit since 2017, and it comes just days after the U.S. airstrike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani last week. Earlier on Tuesday, Iran said it had launched missile strikes against two bases that housed U.S. soldiers in Iraq and did not seek escalation or war. Iranian state television says U.S. helicopters and military equipment were severely damaged. U.S. President Donald Trump said in a tweet on Tuesday that an assessment of casualties and damage was underway, and so far, so good. Iran's supreme leader on Wednesday says Tehran's missile attacks are a slap in the face for the United States.
Now, the issue of vengeance or retaliation is a different issue. Well, we just gave them a slap in the face last night. This is a different story. Now, what matters when it comes to reciprocity, these are military action this way. That's not sufficient. What matters is that the presence of America, that's a source of corruption in this region, that should come to an end.
European powers are caught between supporting the U.S. while looking to prevent further bloodshed in the Middle East, urging both the U.S. and Iran to cool tensions. After meeting with Erdogan, Putin will host German Chancellor Merkel in Moscow on Saturday. Will there be a window for conflict de-escalation?
For more on Russian President's visit to the Middle East, in Washington we have Bülent Alireza, Director and Senior Associate from the Turkey Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In Moscow, we are joined by Pavel Falkenhauer, a Russian political and defense analyst. In Ankara, we are joined by Selçuk Çalhanoğlu, who is a professor in the Department of International Relations. In Yildirim Beyazit, I hope I pronounced your university's name right, in Turkish. And also in Beijing, we are having Zhou Rong, a senior analyst from the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Alireza, what is really on the agenda? Several things: Libya, Syria, or actually what's going on in Iran?
Well, obviously, Iran has come to the top of the agenda after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And here in Washington, we're expecting President Trump to make an address within the next 2 hours, responding to the Iranian attack on the base in Iraq, where American soldiers were stationed. Apparently, no Americans were killed, but clearly, it's the kind of retaliation that Trump warned against. So we'll see what he has to say. Now, beyond that, of course, as you mentioned, Libya is a developing story. Haftar's forces, renegade General Haftar's forces, with the backing of the Russians, have captured the important town of Sirte. And Syria, the civil war continues. The Russian president's visit to Assad was a sort of a triumphal tour, if you like, because with Russian help and, of course, Iranian help, Assad has managed to capture most of the country, and the remaining parts of the country under the control of the opposition, Idlib, are under attack from the Russians. And the last two issues obviously figured in the conversations between Presidents Putin and Erdogan, because they're effectively on opposite sides of this issue, but they're trying to cooperate nonetheless, especially when it comes to the energy issue.
All right. Mr. Falkenhauer, there are so many things going on all at the same time. I want to go through what's going on with Iran and the United States at this moment for the update of the news. First of all, crash of the Iranian plane. So far, no one claimed the responsibility. We do not know the cause. Earlier, it was suggested a technical problem. Then later, there might be blurred information coming from all sides. Then there's also a bombing of the U.S. military base. However, nobody was hurt, only creating some kinds of scenes over there, so in the buffer zone. So, Mr. Falkenhauer, what does Russia make of the latest round of interactions between the United States and Iran? How is this tied, do you think, to the real nature of issues as Russia reads it, how U.S. sees it, and how Iran sees it?
Well, the Russian position is rather clear. Russia is on the side, basically, of Iran. The Russian TV, Russian commentators, the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry were praising the slain Iranian general Qasem Soleimani as a great fighter against terrorism, and he, of course, did coordinate the campaign against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. And then, so Russia is basically on the Iranian side at the same time, but that's more kind of talk, propaganda. Also, there was been the Russian defense minister phoned his Iranian counterpart, the chief of general staff. But of course, Russia does not have any combat troops in Iraq or Iran or the Gulf area, and no ships right now, battleships also in the area, and most likely would try to stay away and out of this conflict as far as possible, though maybe offering Iran some support in the UN and some diplomatic support. Many in Russia see the Americans as the archenemy. I mean, we have our own Moscow-based so-called party of war, those who are kind of believe that we should oppose America almost on any issue. There are, of course, those who believe that there's more room for cooperation, and we have a President Putin who's kind of coordinating between them. So Russia right now is a bit on the sidelines in that issue, though basically supporting Iran.
Mr. Falkenhauer, if I could just follow up a little bit now. Some suggest that what the U.S. and Iran has been doing over the past 24 hours are gestures and gestures and gestures to calm down domestic politics, while at the same time trying to see if there's still any space for seeking solutions, for example, about JCPOA and other things, sanctions included. So, Mr. Falkenhauer, do you think Russia obviously understand the real nature of what's going on, and what do you think Moscow will make of this real nature now between Iran and Washington?
Any politics always has, of course, a domestic dimension and a foreign dimension. And this is actually a big problem, because this is a serious impediment to any attempts to de-escalate. Everyone's right now talking about that we should de-escalate this conflict, shouldn't go into the cycle of escalation. But there are internal problems in Washington, internal problems in Tehran, in Baghdad, and other nations involved in Israel, in Syria, that would seriously impede any attempts to actually return to the pre-war situation. Because the pre-war situation for Iranian leadership is a kind of, well, I mean, their economy is ruined by sanctions. The Americans are pressurizing them, and they have to want to get out of that, and so on and so forth.
I see.
That means Russia would also want to see, most likely, doesn't want, I mean, no one wants to see these skirmishes that right now are happening between the Iranians and the Americans, or Americans and pro-Iranian forces in Iraq, to escalate into a regional war or even worse. But how to actually de-escalate it, where is the basis of a compromise between Tehran and Moscow and Washington, and of course maybe Tel Aviv. That seems almost impossible to achieve.
Mr. Çalhakoglu, coming to our chat from Turkey, let me ask you about this. The earlier two gentlemen have already set the stage of the latest, the general situation in the Middle East, and where the major players are. Tell me where Turkey is, particularly how Turkey is reading the situational change after the Iranian general was assassinated by the United States and all the dramas afterwards.
Turkey actually is in the middle between all these happenings in Iraq, particularly between the United States and Iran. And particularly the Turkish government has very good relationship both with the Trump administration in the United States and also the Iranian leadership, both with the President Khamenei and also the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. So these position for Turkey to protect its presence and also interest basically in the Middle East and particularly in Iraq, and also not taking a side if there is a further confrontation between the United States and Iran in the Middle East. So Turkey wants to keep away itself from any kinds of confrontation and also wants to protect its interest in the region without getting cost for itself. So the main concern right now, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani last week, to call calm down of the crisis, and also made a several statements, official statements, to call both sides to calm down, and also keeping dialogues both with Iran, the United States, and other actors like Russia and European actors for that. So Turkey has a waiting concern, but does not want to take a side for this confrontation.
Mr. Çalhakoglu, if I could follow up about that. Now, Turkey and Russia, since we're talking about Russian president's visit to Turkey, has really interested and intertwined relations. On the one hand, on the issue of Syria, the two countries do not necessarily agree with one another on some of the very important areas of this issue. However, there seems to be still possibility to cooperation. Meanwhile, on the greater Middle East, Russia has ever more increasing impact and influence, while Turkey may have a different attitude about that. And Turkey is having interesting relationship between Washington and also Moscow. So, Mr. Çalhakoglu, this makes Turkey a very interesting place and a very interesting player among all of this. Your take?
Exactly. When we look at the Turkish-Russian relationship in general, So there is an increasing cooperation for energy, economy, and other fields. So there is a rising partnership. Today also, Russian President Putin called Turkey-Russia relations as a strategic partnership. So when we considered all these developments in economic fields and energy, so there is a very deeply rising integration and cooperation between two countries. On the other side, there are also differences and sometimes not military but the political conflicts in Syria, in Eastern Mediterranean, and also Libya. But in recent years, both countries developed a mechanism to keep a dialogue and also build up a negotiation to diminish the differences between two countries for political fields, particularly in Syria. So it worked well. So the mood is there. But on the others, of course, there is a very delicate balance for Ankara between Washington and also Moscow. Particularly President Erdogan has a very good relationship, both President Putin and President Trump. Until now, it has worked well, but we don't know how it will develop in coming months. But the recent months show that Turkey will be able to keep this delicate balance in successful manner without creating a big crisis between two big powers.
Mr. Zhou here sitting in Beijing, let me also go to you for a question or two. Mr. Zhou, things are so intertwined, Mr. Zhou. Over here,
yes.
Please, sir.
Yes.
How shall we understand all the latest, the faster development, all the events related to U.S. and Iran having an impact on all of this already very complicated relationship? This time on Turkey and Russia, do they see eye to eye in terms of de-escalating the tension in the area? If there is a space, who's likely to play a bigger role? And now Iran and the United States certainly are already having some very difficult relationships. You don't see that relationship to get better very soon. So what does that mean for the two countries, Turkey, Russia?
Turkey's role may be more important because Turkey maintained good relations with both Iran and the United States. For personal relationship, President Rouhani as well as President Trump both maintained good personal relationship with President Erdogan. And also Turkey is one of the NATO ally of the United States, and Turkey and Turkey and Iran, they are neighbors. For Russia, because it's so powerful, so Russia's influence is much more important and more globally than Turkey. But Russia's relation with the United States is limited. So Russia can play some role, but may not necessarily just play the bigger role. What I'm saying here, Russia may support, as our Russian friend said, may support Iran rhetorically, verbally, but may not just support any kind of revenge, retaliation against U.S. from that, you see. So Russia can just try to coordinate. Whether they are able to do that or not, it's not important, but they try to play a coordinating role, try to, what we say, try to make them to stay down together.
Okay.
But I'm sure that in the future, even the door between the United States and Iran may not necessarily tightly closed. I think they still may find some opportunity to have certain kind of engagement.
Very interesting. Certainly the events today have already suggesting some interesting twists and turns. Mr. Ali Riza, you've been tentatively listening to your colleagues. Now, you're a scholar about the Turkish issue in the United States, and certainly at the same time you feel all the politics that is going on in your political capital. So how do you think this relationship between Iran and the United States, which is the biggest topic for Washington now in the election year, will have a spillover effect for all the other already complicated relationships, in this case, certainly Turkey and Russia? Mr. Ali Reza.
Well, you know, it's not just the election year. We also have an impeachment process.
That's right.
The House of Representatives has already impeached President Trump, and we're now waiting for the issue to come up in the Senate. Look, this is a tremendous risk for President Trump. It may be the biggest risk that he's taken since he became president. It will impact on all of U.S. relations, all aspects of U.S. relations, not just with Iran, where I think that you know, we have a pause in the crisis, but doesn't mean that we will not see escalation soon. But also because of the ongoing crisis between Washington and Tehran, we're going to have issues. The issue manifesting itself as a problem or as a potential problem in relations with Turkey, for example. Just yesterday, when he was meeting the Greek Prime Minister, President Trump was asked about a comment that President Erdogan apparently made, calling Qasem Soleimani a martyr. President Trump said that he regretted the comment. So obviously, even though the two men have a good relationship, even a reported comment by President Erdogan becomes an issue. Also, the Iranians have said that they regard any country that hosts American soldiers in the region, and that includes Turkey, as potential targets. So if this relationship worsens, or if the crisis worsens between Tehran and Washington, Turkey is going to be squeezed in the middle. Now, it's calling for restraint, but that is hardly likely given the fact that Iran has lost a very important commander, and the U.S., as judged by the comments of President Trump, shows no sign of de-escalating. Other countries' relationships with Washington, including Russia, are, I think, all going to be impacted, but for the moment, it all depends on what Trump and Khamenei do.
All right. You know, there's one important question, gentlemen. With what's going on between U.S. and Iran, there's likely to be two issues. One, what about the U.S. troops in the Middle East as a result of the latest incident? Second, what's likely to be the intertwined relationship already existing there and now has an impact as a result of the U.S.-Iranian relationship? So with all of these questions unanswered still today, what do you think, gentlemen, the Middle East is heading for? More chaos, more big player conflicts, or more strategic gains for some at this moment? Let me have every one of you to touch upon that with brief words. Go to you, Mr. Felgentauer, first.
I believe that there is serious potential for further escalation of the present confrontation. It could spread out to involving other nations and other places, and Iran has already threatened to hit Israel, and that could involve, Lebanon and Syria, and potentially Russia, which has combat troops in Syria. So there's a very serious potential of bad things happening, and there should be a lot of effort to prevent the worst-case scenarios of becoming real.
I see. Mr. Çolakoglu, from the Turkish perspective?
Turkey wants to keep the balance as much as possible. So then the desired situation for Turkey, Turkey's particularly strong presence, both politically and economically in Syria and Iraq, and also keeping balance between regional actors and also great powers in the region. But the main concern here, the coming months will be more hectic, and also then Turkey calls more calm for all actors in the region.
Mr. Joe?
Yeah, I think the very important thing which people like to ignore is that the international peacekeeping force may stay together, may just do their best to coordinate the conflict between Iran and the United States, and let de-escalate such tension and some very dangerous situation. So I'm still very optimistic about the future.
Mr. Ali Reza, last but not least.
I'm not optimistic at all. The Middle East has always been bedeviled by problems. You know, we forget that all the way back to the 1940s, we had the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which continues to this day. Just recently, Turkey decided to send troops into Libya, for example. So we have to keep an eye on what's going to happen in Libya, where there is ongoing and worsening fighting. Syria, Iraq. Iraq is pushing out the American troops. We did not mention this.
Yeah.
That might not have been a decision made if it wasn't for the U.S. killing of Qasem Soleimani. We haven't talked about the Gulf. Iran is specifically threatened Dubai and shipping in the Gulf, from where a lot of the oil that goes to consumers, including in Asia, come from. So, you know, it's, I think, easy to predict that there is going to be more trouble, and just calling for calm and moderation, I think, is going to be somewhat futile given the tensions involved in the region.
With such an intertwined region and also so many players trying to play a role in that region for various reasons, 2020 is destined to be a year with a lot of events, to say the least. For now, I want to thank the four of you gentlemen for being with us. Mr. Ali Reza, Mr. Felgenhauer, Mr. Çalhakoglu, and Mr. Zhou. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight, the program coming to you live from Beijing. Later, China's foreign exchange reserves rose in December. How can China maintain economic growth? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's now turn to China's foreign exchange reserve. Numbers were released by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange on Tuesday. China's foreign exchange reserves stood at approximately $3.11 trillion at the end of December. Meanwhile, the foreign exchange regulators also decided to improve its services to the public by removing 11 documents required for businesses to use foreign exchange. Before we get down to the discussion, take a look at this first.
China's forex reserves bounced back to above $3.1 trillion by the end of December. That's about $35 billion from the start of 2019. China's business environment continues to improve. During the 12 months ending May 1st, China carried out a record 8 business reforms, ranking among the world's 10 most improved economies for ease of doing business for the second year in a row. Meanwhile, the foreign investment law that took effect this month aims to broaden market access for foreign businesses. Latest data shows by the end of 2019, nearly 1 million foreign invested enterprises have been set up in China, with FDI into China ranking first among all developing countries for 27 consecutive years. That is a vote of confidence in China's financial market and efforts made for business reforms.
For more on China's economy and certainly the number of China's foreign exchange reserve, we are joined in New York City, Anthony Chen, former Chase chief economist at J.P. Morgan. In our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor Liu, how should we see the increase of the number in terms of China's foreign exchange reserve? Does it have much to do with trade?
Well, actually, there are two sides to this coin. And one is that China does really have tighter control over the outflow of capital. And the other is that Chinese foreign exchange earning capacity out of the export is still very strong. And three is that the foreign direct investment into China is still the major contributor to Chinese foreign exchange reserve. So therefore, given these three forces, actually, to maintain above 3 trillion is something that is really within our expectation.
Okay, Professor Liu, what does it really mean? I mean, when China is having an increasing in terms of the amount of foreign exchange reserve, does it mean China will be more persistent or be strong in its economy, or at least in its interaction in trade, for example, with the United States?
Well, I think 3 trillion is really the comfort level of the Chinese regulators, and there has been much debate over whether China should really maintain such a high level of foreign exchange reserve within the Chinese state-owned state administration of foreign exchange. And more should be given to commercial banks, to the individual business players.
Yeah.
But you know, there is really a consistency in Chinese policy that 3 trillion is really the threshold that they feel comfortable with. But in the meantime, we do see that China is really diversifying. One is the destination of the Chinese foreign exchange reserve, and to reduce reliance on the U.S. And the other is that we are trying also to diversify into more equity positions through different type of funds, etc. So instead of simply use it to buy the treasury bills.
Mr. Chan, your take about the increasing number China foreign exchange reserve?
Well, those 3 factors are especially true, but I'm going to add another factor, and that is that the Chinese yuan has also strengthened, so due to valuation effects, those foreign exchange numbers tend to pick up. You might recall that last year in September, the yuan was 7.18 to the U.S. dollar, and now it's been hovering below 7. In fact, this morning it was at 6.94. So when you see the strength in the Chinese yuan, obviously that also increases the value of these foreign exchange reserves. Also, I would also point out that the strength of the currency is also going to discourage capital outflows and more capital inflows as the Chinese currency gets much stronger. And finally, it's also a reflection, as you pointed out in your prior question, of stronger growth, or at least less negative headwinds for the Chinese economy. To the extent that we now see potential deal between the U.S. and China for a trade deal, that will give more confidence to the Chinese economy. And finally, last year, fiscal policy in China added as much as 0.8% to economic growth in China.
How much, Mr. Chan, does that have to do with China's trade? How much does it have to do with the overall China's economic situation, Mr. Chan, given earlier China's record of exchange reserve number? Usually, what are some of the biggest factors?
I think that right now I would say more it's due to the valuation effects rather than the trade, because when you looked at the latest trade deficit report in the United States, what you actually saw was that Chinese imports into the United States actually went down because of tariffs. The more you increase tariffs, the more you discourage the imports. To the extent that you roll back some of those tariffs, you will see Chinese exports picking up, but we have not seen that in the data as of yet.
However, on the other hand, Professor Liu, China's trade with the other economies have been increasing, while the importance of the U.S. in terms of trade with China, if you look at the number, has been decreasing. So how much of that foreign exchange reserve has much to do with the United States, or now it's more about the other economies, Professor?
Yes, I think that's a very good question, because the world actually has been, major economies has been discussing as how they can really reduce their reliance on the U.S. dollar, given that the fluctuation of the U.S. dollar valuation. And so we do notice that one is that many more countries are trying to adopt other currencies and, as foreign exchange reserve, for example, euro and Japanese yen, etc. And the other is that we are also diversifying, or as you say, our trading partners, because some of the trading partners we deliberately choose RMB as a denominating currency. And then also we are now trying to diversify what we call the shadow reserves, which means that we are translating some of the hard currencies into equity positions through fund management. So, this can really, spread eggs in different baskets, and in the meantime strengthen the application of RMB in international trade transactions.
Yeah. A lot of these, of course, are very interesting issues themselves. However, the ultimate question is, what's likely to be the state of China's economy for the year 2020? I guess behind all of the questions we ask, there's always an ultimate question. That is the one. Mr. Chen, what is your reading, given the fact that some of the numbers are picking up over the past 1 month or two?
Oh, absolutely. I think that things are, in fact, getting better. We know that longer term, as the Chinese economy continues to mature, economic growth will slow down a little bit. But for 2020, I look for economic growth in China for real GDP to grow about 6%, which I think is a very healthy number for the Chinese economy. So I'm very confident that you will see 6% growth in 2020.
Right. Professor Liu, now, China-U.S. trade deal, first phase, according to the latest information we have got, particularly from the U.S. side, has a lot to do with talking about standards, talking about international practices, talking about opening China's market, talking about implementation of all of the above. So, Professor Liu, if the first phase being signed as earlier indicated, what does that mean for the nature of China's economic growth for the year 2020 in terms of quality? When quality, if up, will the speed still be following up the quality increase or growth?
I think it's a contributor. One very important issue is the business sentiment. So, given that the phase one can really settle at least the trajectory where the China-U.S. Economic relations will be heading into a sort of strategic engagement instead of acceleration of the trade tension, and that's rather fundamental. The other issue is that yes, we are trying to enlarge our export or imports from the United States, which can really feed on two ends. One is really the consumer, high-end consumer goods. The other would be the raw materials like the agricultural produce and natural gas, etc. That can feed in China. But however, however much of the commitment has been made, it's really up to the market to decide, whether the price is right, whether the quantity is right. So I think it's really a contributor. As to the general performance of the Chinese economy, I think two indicators can really help the strength of the Chinese economy.
Okay.
One is the dust settling of the China-U.S. trade friction, and the other, I think, is more important, is the 28 principles set forth to provide equal level playing field between Chinese private business sector, foreign business sector, and state-owned sector. So this is really something that is very fundamental to support the confidence of the Chinese private business sector, because they are the major contributor to the Chinese economy and also for its export.
Mr. Chen, we have about 1 minute to go. What is your take if things about the earlier mentioned first phase likely to be implemented? What does that mean to the Chinese economy?
Well, what it means is that you're going to see more opportunities out there. Remember that with this, we're going to be taking back and rolling back some of those tariffs, which will facilitate more exports from China into the United States. But the IMF and the World Bank has also said that these trade tensions have reduced world economic growth by almost 1%. So to the extent that we start pulling back some of that trade tension and removing some of those tariffs, guess what? It's going to enlarge world economic growth, and increase in world economic growth is going to mean more opportunities for the Chinese economy, more opportunities for the U.S. economy, and more opportunities for others. So everyone has a positive boost from the reduced trade tensions. However, the phase one is only the first initial stage, and it's not going to solve all the problems overnight.
but it is definitely a step in the direction of lifting some of those negative headwinds from economic growth from China and from many other economies around the world.
Well, we want to thank both of you for helping us to understand the latest about the Chinese economy and certainly the foreign exchange reserve from perspectives of different areas. Thank you so much, Anthony Chen, Liu Baocheng. Appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us. World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, Facebook, and Twitter accounts. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the team, thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.